I'd like to introduce Liz from Scotland, who has multiple sclerosis. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you very much.
Could you tell me when you first started to notice MS symptoms?
I was first noticed when I was about 19 years old, but wasn't sure at that point. Wasn't a firm diagnosis made in those years, because that's a number of years ago, and you had to have 3 incidents before they would actually give you a diagnosis. So my grandmother, grandmother on my father's side had MS, and my parents had been quite concerned when they were having a family and had looked into whether there was any problems, and been told that it was a familial disease rather than genetically passed on disease.
Mm-hmm.
So I was 19 when I first had something obscure.
And when were you diagnosed?
I wasn't diagnosed till I was 27,
mm-hmm.
and that was after having 3 incidents, which each one was then put together. They were all quite strange, but the final one, fortunately for me, was quite a classic thing to happen, and in that I had that optic neuritis. Mm-hmm. And so I was really fortunate in that it was a quick diagnosis from that, but then putting the other history with that. Mm-hmm. So I was very lucky in that respect.
So how did it affect you and your family, you being diagnosed with MS?
Well, it was devastating at the time, because my 2 children were young. They were 4 and 2 years old. But I was relieved that that's what it was, and wasn't something more life-threatening. I remember feeling that. But I wasn't given much help at all. I wasn't living in Scotland at that point, actually. I was living in England. I was living in Hull, where it was diagnosed. And it was extremely offhand and brusque, as everybody was in those days. It was a very difficult time. There's no support and no follow-up at all, because there's nothing they could do. Mm-hmm. At the time. I wasn't a candidate for drugs, even the drugs that were available at that time. But I had symptoms that were affecting my functioning, so it was difficult with 2 young children.
Yes. What were your symptoms, Liz?
Well, symptoms were, first, the optic neuritis. I was blind in my left eye for 6 months. I had numb legs from the waist down, couldn't walk very far. My left hand was barely erratic in its function, and it's a difficulty putting on and off the children's clothing because I couldn't do fine movements. So buttons and poppers and nappy pins were a nightmare at that point. I was very tired. I had a dreadful fatigue was the main problem. And coping with 2 young children, you know how energetic you have to be to cope with them. So it was hard, but I got through it with the help of friends and family. And then we moved to Scotland 2 years after that. And that's where actually I met, because there's far more people up here with MS, I actually hooked into a group in Oban, where I live in the west coast of Scotland, and got a lot of help and support from that group. Mm-hmm. And my story then goes on to going into the alternative side of helping MS, and that is using hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So I've done that now for 27 years. Mm-hmm. So I found that really helpful.
And how old are you now, Liz?
I am 54.
Oh, same age as me.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you find LDN? Was it from this group?
Yeah, no, LDN, I've been looking over the years at various options, because the hyperbaric is good. It helps to keep you stable, but I was constantly looking for something that I could use just to get me a bit better, because the symptoms have deteriorated over the years. My walking is very poor. Energy levels were really low. Although I do work 2 days a week, I'm a midwife, so I was fairly energetic getting out cars with that. But I found LDN. I looked on it's not advertised in the Pathways magazine, which comes via the MS group, it's the national group, and was very interested. I read all the stories and followed that up. And then we have a doctor in Scotland, in Glasgow, Dr. Tom Gilhooly, that really pioneered it here in Scotland. Mm-hmm. So I went to visit him and to took LDN and had a fantastic response within 10 days. I must say, it just transformed my life at that point, because I hadn't been very well at all. I'd had a very bad summer 2 years ago. I was definitely not well. It was a very hot summer here in Scotland, and I don't do very well in the heat. Even our heat doesn't have to be exotic heat. So I was very, very low in mood and very heavy limbs. Felt as if I was wading through porridge all the time and couldn't get up in the morning. I was just absolutely flattened, even though I'd slept all night. And I went to this doctor in Glasgow, and he did some blood tests and advised me to look at a dairy-free diet to reduce inflammation, which I've tried. I'm not very strict on it, but I do watch the dairy intake, and I've given me some supplements. Got my vitamin D level checked, which was actually very low. So I got on supplements and the LDN, and within 10 days the LDN had made such a difference. I felt like I turned the clock back 10 years. It was amazing. So I've continued taking it for the last 2 years. I haven't had more and more improvements, but I'm certainly stable, relatively stable. I'm happier with what I'm now able to do. And I'm walking a little bit more, so that's good. I can do probably just under the mile without dragging my feet. So that's a huge improvement. So I'm not going to run a marathon or anything like that, but I might manage to do a bit more walking, and I can certainly cycle again, which I wasn't doing. I really enjoy that.
So if you had to score your quality of life before you started LDN on a score of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, what would you say it was before LDN?
I would say it was about 4.
And now?
And now I would say 8.
And that's in how long?
But in 2 years.
2 years. That's really good, isn't it? Did you have any introductory side effects when you started?
Nothing at all. No, I got started on 1 ml daily, and I've just gone up to 2 mLs, and I've maintained my fault. So I was actually 4 days without it. And I very quickly realised how much it is doing, because I was back to how I felt 2 years ago. And I was wading through porridge and just couldn't get up in the morning and just felt awful again. So that convinced me that I was right to keep going on it.
Well, thank you very much, Liz, for sharing your story with us.
Okay. Thank you very much for asking me.